All right, so this will be a quick primer about overview. So, the render view, not a lot of people use it, but I think it's cool because you can press Alt Z in order to jump around it, which can be useful for times where you just need to troubleshoot and look at the model, but also you maybe want a technical view from the side. So you can just lock it down like this and turn off render visibility for all the other viewport elements and just get a quick wire render. Well, a lot of people online always ask for, can you show the wires? So that's really what this view's for. And of course, with this little arrow, there's always drop-down options for you choosing specific things about a viewport. So even in this wire mode, we have options for it just being a single color or everything being white or random. And then you can even give it a background and have like a very specific type of background going on here for your wireframe presentation. So it doesn't have to be exactly just bland viewport on that gray. In fact, continuing on, that whole viewport thing, this gray is like the most famous gray of all time. So if you're posting pictures with this gray, either make sure the model's damn good or change that freaking color because it's just such a... Blender had like a blue that was like the most common blue ever because everybody used it. So you can always just change those colors up here. That's the point I'm getting across. So, now we're in the shading view where you can look at things either as a studio cap or you can jump it over to matcap and look at it with one of our matcaps here. In fact, we'll make it just a single shade just for simplicity. So we'll make it object instead of using the material colors from material assignment or using random colors, which will make every single object a different color. So sometimes when I want to just see which objects are different objects, this is the best way to do it. Just make it random. But we'll change this back to object. Shut the hell up. So we'll leave this as object. And, like I said, you can always change the color of your world in your viewport. And then down here, you have options for the viewport as far as making your model look good. So the easiest way to turn all that stuff off is to jump this down to what's called EVLQ, which should have actually turned off all this stuff. But this is what your default Blender viewport looks like. And a lot of other people out there make their viewports just look as bland as possible, but there's no real delineator in the surfaces and stuff like that, which is something that visually bugs me. So for that reason in Hardops, you can press Alt V for the viewport submenu, which you should be familiar with because we've talked about it a couple of times in the past. But just jumping it up to EVHQ will actually turn on like surface transition shading in here in the form of world space, cavity, masking, and shading for you to, and also, using world space as cavity looks like this. And then there's another state that uses screen, which is also very cool, but it makes everything look kind of chiseled on the edges. And then Blender finally added a third option called both, which will use both world and screen, getting us a real nice viewport for our shapes and our transitions. And I kind of use this view as a technical view because I can see where the mesh is breaking down in areas and then get in there and address it. So it's kind of how I use it. So, we're in matcap and the matcaps are actually stacked in orders. Like the first stack is a presentation, I think. And then the second one is a different type of presentation. And then the third one is more of troubleshooting. So, when I talk about troubleshooting, a common thing in CAD is, zebra stripes, which I actually go to this all the time. And I'll just roll my zebra stripes across the model just to see how good I did as far as topology, curve, and surface management. So sometimes this thing can be not so good with n-gons. Like, I wish that everything was contiguous and it's, these lines are way big compared to this, but for the most part, what we have here is pretty good for judging the surface. So I just bring this up and I will just roll things around, just kind of, and it tells me what it'll be like when I export it out. Like I can't word it, but if you're familiar with CAD programs and how they use this shit, it's here in a matcap, so it's not anywhere near as good as what you would get in like Fusion 360 or somewhere, but at least they have it. And this one on the second row, which is like the presentation row, I like this material as well. And I'll roll these things around the surface just like this, just over and over, looking at where these curve transitions happen. And then like right here, there's actually a shading issue, like right there, that this matcap is exposing. And also right here is exposing some shortcomings. So I could either get in there and deal with it, or I could just leave it and just call it a day. So you got to pick your battles. You can be really crazy about your shading, or you can just get good enough shading. So flat is cool because with flat, you can just look at the model in just a flat state. So, I mean, if you're familiar with ZBrush and how you can look at things through their different matte caps, like their flat view and shaded view and render view, it's the same thing here. So we're almost to the finale, which is talking about look dev, which ties into render. Personally, I love look dev because look dev gives you an environment map for free. Well, not for free because it doesn't work in the render, but it does work in the viewport, and you can just see what your model would look like in various lighting conditions. If you're, I was first familiar with this sort of look dev thing when using Quixel and Substance Designer. They had different matte caps that you could just look through for just kind of evaluating your scene, and Blender is no exception here. You can also expose your world by turning up the background, and then from here we can actually really look at this scene as if it were some sort of like real-time render. But this is actually our real-time render. Our real-time render is just us with our lights in the scene and the world that is established. And the world is the same color as this goddamn background. So that's why every time you jump to the render tab, it just looks dead and sad and boring. And it's nothing against Blender. It's best to be that way because you can get in there and fix it. But just in my opinion, every time I jump to render, I'm like, oh, it's just kind of sad. Like I'll be working with someone, I'm like, hey, jump to render. And I jump to the render, bam, sad render. So render is actually what's going to carry over whenever you press F12 and render your scene or render your animation, which is, what we'll be talking about here is like model and showcase and stuff like that. This is where you want to set stuff up. So, the properties panel over here, Jay, you're the loudest typer ever. The properties, can you please type louder? All right, so I'm gonna have to mute you guys. All right, so continuing on here, we're now in the render panel and we have our world here. The world is the first circle that has a color in it. So that's how I delineate when I look at these. These are all kind of utilities dealing with the actual blend file itself and its data, with the colored icons being stuff that pertains to like the experience in your stuff specifically selected. Kind of hard to explain, but I think that's what they're going for here. Otherwise, I don't know why these don't have color. So, we're in the world scene and we're in the render. So we're actually configuring the render at this point. Keep in mind that everything that I'm talking about also carries over. Keep in mind that everything I'm talking about as well also carries over into cycles. Let me pause this for just a sec. All right, so now I'm back at it. So whenever you look at the world tab, your first question is probably like, how do I set up a freaking world in here? And Blender's answer for it is these freaking dots on the side, which I find to be slightly unwelcoming to beginners. I find that teaching people this, people often forget where they go to set up their world. So I'm just emphasizing this right now so that whenever you're dealing with this, you remember that if you don't want a color, you click this dot and it will let you select a node. And you want to choose an environment texture. In your heart, you're going to want to choose image texture, but let me just tell you that's not the good choice here, and don't do that. So we're going to choose environment texture, and the scene's going to go pink. Pink is Blender's way of saying, screw you. You loaded an image, but there's no image. So the first thing we got to do is actually go in here and choose an image. So I'm going to go under HDR, and we're just going to load up one of the HDRs here. I'm just going to choose just one at random. And of course, this thing will automatically map it to the screen. And damn it, I got a freaking big ass watermark on this thing. So I don't want that showing up in my background of my renders. So now we're stepping over into advanced rendering like 101 because we have the HDR that we want here. Like, maybe not. I could change this to anything by just clicking the folder and just reloading a different one. For me, it's packing the scene, so it's not letting me click the folder here. It's actually giving me an option to unpack and then click the folder because I'm using a packed scene. But that aside, let's say we wanted to not, all these HDRs have big ass watermarks on them. So we don't want that in our renders. And also, we don't want to show our renders with a HDR behind it. I always worry that the HDR will take more focus than the render itself. So for that reason, it's important to hide it. So at the tabs on the top, you can just go to the shading tab, but we can also just split the viewport. I feel bad because I never told you about splitting the viewport, but you can actually just grab the corner of a 3D view and split it, and then split it, and then split it. I mean, I am the worst teacher ever because I never told you this Blender 101 stuff, but it's the truth. Like, you can split these views, merge these views, all sorts of stuff, but you can only merge a view with a view that's like the same length or width that you're trying to merge, depending on if you're trying to merge it length over width. So I can't merge this view with this view. I can't merge this view with this view because this view is half the size of this one. So to merge this out, I would need to bring this over, and then I could bring this one up, and then now it's back consolidated. So I have this presentation view here of me looking at it in flat, and then I have it in this render view. So I'm just showing you this because, you know, showing your model like this will make it look cool and show people that you're a technical artist. You know, you're in here evaluating this shiznit off the hizzy, you know. So we're going to change it to a shader editor, and this is where you would basically modify your shader. So here we see that it's on material. We don't want material because we're not talking about materials today. We're talking about world. So over here with world, the first thing you're going to need to know how to do in Blender is use your background for lighting, but not show it. And so this right here is something that you'll need to remember forever. I'm going to just Shift-D duplicate this background node, and we're just going to bring in a mix shader, and we're just going to plug up this mix shader here at the same time. And you can see that by dealing with the factor, I can make it either use all of this input or all of this input. So this one's being driven by the HDR, but here we are with the scene being lit, and here it is with gray. And you can just see by the lighting just dying that there's just no interest there. So we want interesting lighting, but we don't want the background being there. So I'll send you a screenshot of this afterwards to let you know that how to just set this up. But, you know, we should set up your default scene where you're automatically set up to do this sort of stuff, so you don't have to set up these nodes at all. But having an understanding on how to do it will definitely be beneficial for this. So we want to use a what's called a light path, and a light path is like a factor filter type thing. I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about nodes at all. So when it comes to this sort of stuff, we're going to take is camera ray and make that the factor. And we almost have the result that we want, except the model is shaded like our gray, but a background is showing. So if we flip these by just switching their inputs, now we have the model rendering on a gray background that we can actually set this to any color we want now. Like, this is now just a red gun on a red background, like blood time, boom, 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 boom. You know, I'm just having some fun with the render here, but and even more interesting is we could bring in, like, say, a RGB as an input and then plug that up to the color instead. And then now we can just change it through here and just find the right color for our happy little gun. Like, this gun's a friend, so we're going to give it like a color you would use for a baby boy's room. So that's basically using Eevee in a nutshell, just kind of getting started with it. Now, keep in mind that right here, we messed up my layout, which usually I always just stay on the default layout and then just do what I have to do. Sometimes I'll jump to shading to do things, but all these are just layouts. So this layout, we'll call this shading 2. So let's duplicate it, and we'll just call this shading 2. So this is the shading 2 layout. And the reason I duplicated it by right clicking it is because I do want to maintain the purity of my scene by having this be just one layout. So this is it. So if we go back, we have our wire view, which, you know, kind of looks terrible. Let's make every view look good. That's our objective here. Where can we deal with the color of the wires themselves? Maybe they have a setting for that. Probably not from the looks of it. Also, I'm not going to go digging for that, so let's just roll with the punches. We'll get a random here, get a viewport, give it a darker color, and, you know, we'll call that a good viewport. You know, you can scrutinize me in the comments and say that's an ugly ass viewport, and, you know, I'll laugh at it and take it in stride. So on the next one, we have our shading. So let's make this viewport look good. So, you know, I like random, but, you know, let's put it on material and use a studio cap. Studio caps are like matte caps, except they're not. They're studio caps. So, you know, that's all I can really tell you for it. I'm not, like I said, I'm just telling you about the viewport as I perceive it, not like I read the manual or anything. So this is this viewport. We're done with that. We go to look dev, things are already looking good here. Look devs are just going to use the materials that we assign to the model. So we'll just find a layout that works. Maybe look at it in perspective so there's reflections in the model. And then we go to render. So render still looks slightly terrible, but just to go over rendering as well in a nutshell, for hard ops, we've simplified render a little bit because you can actually go through these settings over here and play with your shadow size, your indirect lighting, which you can actually insert objects called cube maps for models that are sitting still static. Let's see, light probes, reflection cube map. This one will help generate the reflections in an area. Probably not appropriate for this model here, but if we were dealing with a room, some of these things would be more relevant. This one is the irradiance probe. So this one will allow you to bake lighting in an area for like bounce lighting. Because, you know, if you're rendering something that's like near something else, the relationship of the light bouncing off into color and all that shit like that, you know, that's what Pixar's all about. So you can definitely get that sort of effect here. And so I have a light map here, and the button that has the hard op symbol is a basic drop down for dealing with hop stuff. And inside of there is a bake option. So we'll just bake the indirect lighting. And you see it down here baking. So it's just baking the lighting for the scene. This is like if I really wanted to just, wow. I actually see that Blender's telling me not only how much time has elapsed, but how much time's remaining. I have never seen that in my life. That is new. Holy moly. That is amazing. So, you know, Blender just gets better and better. You know, even this video is going to be immediately outdated. But, you know, instead of sitting here waiting for this bake, I'll go back into the lighting. And we probably want a sun here because there's really just not a lot happening here with our lighting. And let's look at it in the render mode. And that's actually a little bit better. So now at this point, we can actually bake the lighting. I don't want to bake the lighting if it isn't going to look good at all. So you see right here, you can bake the indirect lighting in the cube map. So in a general workflow, we assume you are working with control spacebar and you don't have this view. You don't have access to those properties on the side. So that's where you would use the hops button and just bake the lighting and just wait for it for a moment. So we'll just let this bake, and it may or may not look better. I mean, I'm no authority on lighting in Blender. I'm just slowly working on it myself, trying to get better at it over time as Blender adds tools that kind of make it fundamentally easier. I mean, right now it's baking a little hard, and that's because you can see under my Eevee HQ that my cube map resolution is set to 2048. So over here, you can actually set your HQ to be any like level depending on your computer. So if you're trying to get the absolute best render ever and your computer's beefy as hell and you have confidence your computer can handle it, jump it on 4096, you crazy bastard. But let me tell you, it's going to make your shit slow, and it sucks. So I always work at 2048 because I see that it works across all my computers with the least amount of issues. But really, 2048 for you mad lads out there that think that you can push it to the metal, you could just jump it up to 4096, click EVHQ, and then from there, all your settings for the render and look dev for the light reflections and its calculating of like local reflections is going to be bumped up for you. So you can always do that in the render settings. In fact, I recommend that you go through the render settings and play with this stuff. But, you know, I found the settings here to be like wordy and long and complicated. So we just simplified it into EVHQ and LQ. But the most important area to talk about is screen space reflections. When I first experienced these in Marmoset, I was like, whoa, they were nuts because I finally got to see other objects and other objects, but in real time. So refraction will make it where glass will actually behave as glass. So just to demonstrate that real quick, we're going to bring in a sphere and we're just going to sharpen it. Just hard surface smooth. You know, this has no hard edges, so we know it's going to be a perfect sphere that's smooth. So we can run sharpen on it all day with confidence. And we're just going to give it a glass material. So bam, glass. And what does that look like? Probably not glass. So let's change the blend mode to alpha blend. And does that look like glass? No. So we'll click on screen space reflection. Does that look like glass? No. So we activate it here. And does it look like glass? No. This thing does not look like glass at all. So to make it a little bit more realistic, we'll at least give it some thickness through solidify. And then to make it look as much like glass as possible, we'll lower the roughness. And this is basically how I render glass in Eevee. So if we put this in front of this object, we can actually see through it, and you can see the IOR diffracting it, and it looks awesome. And this is with the real-time refraction and everything in Blender. I freaking love this stuff. Like, this is why I had to leave Cycles. I love Cycles with all my heart. It was the best engine ever. Super powerful. Could do everything. However, it was, it was using the GPU. It had a small cookup time. It was getting dated. Adaptive displacement wasn't really a GPU-ish thing. Smoke was still a little slow. It was time to move on. The world was on real time. But we look at this glass, and if you're really looking at this does not look like glass, or this does not look aesthetically pleasing as glass. Like, I wouldn't render this. It looks good, but I don't want to see this HDRI through it and this like half black thing. Like, this thing looks crazy. In fact, it shows me that my HDRI isn't even like properly mapped. So we can go over here and actually expand and look at our HDRI mapping. So right now it's equirectangular. Let's make it a mirror ball. And that didn't make it any better. So we're just going to change that back to equirectangular and continue on talking about glass. Because like I said, this glass looks terrible, right? So let's reevaluate how we're doing glass right now. So I want you to do glass. If you have to do glass, by the way, I just want you to just simplify it to this. Let's just make the shader a mix shader. And we're going to make the first slot of that shader glass. Notice that I'm not in a node editor for this. I've been working on a way to just set this up from here because I hate going to node editor for basic stuff. Hence me making the blank materials addition on hard ops. The next one we want to use is transparent, which is now going to get you a result looking like this. And this is 100 times better. And so by dialing the factor, we can get as much glass as we need, which you can see that is too much. I mean, that's realistic glass according to Blender. But according to what I want for a render, maybe something like that or something like that would probably work better. Chip has a glass material on Gumroad that's free that I recommend for everyone. But I'm just talking about glass and my approach to it in Blender experiences. This is a better glass to me than having it look like just a straight mirror ball with diffraction only happening inside of it. So you can also see right here that when I make it fully transparent, that shadows are still being cast here. So let's look at the shadow mode, and we can make the shadow mode, let's try alpha hash. And now if we enable the glass, you can see that the shadow is dithering into reality. So this is already me talking beyond the scope of my knowledge on these things. Like, I'm not really a Blender master expert. I just know how to use it for my needs, which is making nice renders, rendering boxes. So, for the finale of this, let's talk about volumetrics, because volumetrics are also crucial. So I'm just going to, I'll save this gun one more time. Probably regret it. I should have iteratively saved it because I'm saving a file I modified like a month ago from a demo I'm doing with y'all, just impromptu, because I'm teaching future Empress here some Blender stuff, because you'll find out. So anyways, we're going to switch this over to theme, and because I'm in my renders, meaning my preferences, I have a setting enabled. Sorry, I'm just jumping all over the place, but this will help with keeping y'all on the same page as me. Sometimes people tell me I'm bad at explaining stuff, so I'm trying to work on it. So right here under save and load is an option called load UI. And if you have this checked, when you open a blend file, it will load it in the UI that blend file was saved in. That's all right most of the time, but Proxy showed me that it's kind of cool to have it off, because you can open blend files and they never mess up your layout, which is also kind of crazy. It's like really a preference, all right, because just like save prompt, for Blender's first 80 years of existence, you click the X on the corner of Blender, it will just fuck right off. Like, you click X on Blender, it's gone. No questions asked. Now they realize that, maybe that's kind of mean. People click the X just twitching. They're trying to click some stuff up here. And, they want to click this X and they accidentally click this X. That X is the X. This X is, it's the X. So, some people prefer to have a save prompt. So if you want a save prompt when you click the X, have this enabled. If you want Blender to keep the exact same layout you're looking at when you open a file by just file open or dragging a blend file onto Blender, then you want to keep this on. Otherwise, I keep it off. And that's why every time I make a new file, I'm already in my render and all the settings are on from the last file, and I keep having to turn stuff off. Like right here, I have wires on, so I need to press Alt-V and turn off wireframe. And I'm still in studio view from my last scene. So that means if I jump through these, they're all looking ready for action, except for render. You got to set up a render every time. But to wrap up this video, we're just going to talk about volumetric. So we're in this scene. This is just Eevee, by the way. Not Cycles anymore. It used to be Cycles Gang for life. I'll forever love Brecht von Lommel for his contribution for Blender and modernizing it, because Blender would have been in a different position today if he never would have brought Cycles to the table. So while I have abandoned Cycles for Eevee, I can't stress that the addition of Cycles literally, in my opinion, I think it saved Blender. I think Blender was in a bad way with Blender engine being the way to render, and we were having to hack and use buffered shadows and all this crazy stuff. And this is pretty much like using Marmoset. So anytime I see Sensei Tony using Marmoset, I'm like, dude, you got to try Blender. I mean, it's got like some of the same systems, and at least then you can animate and deal with timelines and link assets and all that cool stuff that 3D apps can do. So I have the spotlight. It's not giving a whole lot of light here. So you can either right click an option and it will an object, it'll give you options. Like right here, I can activate the power. And keep in mind that this is a modal. So if you look in the corner, anytime your UI changes to a number or something, that means you're in a modal, meaning that you got to move your mouse to do something. And then you confirm it by clicking it, and then you're done. So it's a bubblegum behavior that I was talking about. You just want to be aware of it. So right-clicking this and then adjusting the radius, I'm in this bubblegum behavior where I need to move the mouse, click to complete this operation, or right-click and cancel. But that operation is on, and that is the operation, meaning, and I'm trying to explain this in a way that you understand that if you try to do anything else in the middle of a modal, it's not going to work, because the modal has taken over. Just complete the modal and go back to what you were doing. It makes more sense. So we have our light here, and the only thing we're talking about for this conclusion is volumetrics, because they're worth dealing with. So we're back into render tab over here, and I don't even want to bring up the node editor for this. So we're just going to plug in a scatter, and this is the first thing you're going to see. We're going to turn off everything in the viewport just so you can see what they give us by default. So this is like Shanghai level smog right here. So we want good country living smog. So we're going to change this to 0.02. Bam. This is the result that you should be expecting when you set up this sort of workflow, right? Like, you know, back in the day, I used to put cubes on bar stools with a light on it like this as a scene, because I was contemplating going into stand-up if 3D didn't work out. So luckily 3D worked out in a big way. So hence me doing this video right now. But lowering this down to 0.02 will get you less density. And you can see as you play with the settings that it gets really dense really fast. It goes very Shanghai. I mean, you know, I bet Greta would use our volume system to simulate what the world is like, because, you know, we're at 1. But really any setting beyond, let's see, beyond even 0.2 is probably too dark. And then we really have to crank those lights. But this is really how easy scatter is. So let's take it even further. You can see as I look around the cube that the light is kind of breaking around it. Let's select this spot up here. I'm in rendered view, so I can't see anything. I'm just clicking and Jesus take the wheel, and I'm missing. So I'm whiffing it right there. I'll just select in the outliner, and now I can move it around. So let's look at the light settings. So anything you select, there's going to be settings for it in the properties. So because we have a light selected, you have a light option. And because of that, we can go under shadow and turn on contact shadows. And I was expecting something a little bit more impactful to happen there, which didn't happen. But there are settings you can play in here to adjust like the blend to get like a smoother transition. You can see right here, it's like a rough spotlight. But by adjusting the blend, I can get something that's a little more graceful. But what I want is the light to break around the cube, making a crazier looking effect. So it's probably right here. and it still didn't do it. We're not getting that impact yet. So I'm gonna, when it comes to settings, you can either drag these sliders, crank it like Soulja Boy, or, what I do is I will click something and then press multiply or times 2 and then press enter. And then I can press Shift R to multiply it by 2 again. Sometimes, should have. Let's try it again. But anyways, now I have that light and I have it kind of breaking around this cube. This cube's like being interrogated right now. You wouldn't believe the things this cube did. He's nothing like the other cubes we had in our scenes before. This guy's a real threat. So I'm scaling this thing out just so we can really just talk about this guy. I just brought in a plane and just scaled it. I'm in render, so you can't see anything that I can't see either. I don't know what the heck's going on. I just trust in my heart. I'm a big fan of being able to use Blender and even think about your moves in your head before you do them in order to efficiently manage your undo stack. I mean, I don't think I can teach people how to use Blender like me. I don't know. But, I'll be teaching people and people will start undoing stuff and pressing Control C. And I'm like, please don't do that because you removed the options in my head that were set up for the future moves. So I jumped ahead a little bit. We're just going to remove the bevel from this cube. But, if I'm rendering this cube, I'm going to want to press Q, put a little bevel on it, and that's it. So one of the options I want to introduce you to is Alt-M. Alt-M is the material list. So if you have materials in your scene and you need to assign them to a model, you can press Alt-M and it'll bring up all your materials. And then from there, you can just assign a material. Now, if you don't have a material to assign, this material right here is what Blender gives you as a material. Let's delete this material and just make a material. This material right here is what Blender gives you. And I personally do not like that. I mean, it's fine, but it's not a good looking material. It's just white. It's white power, the material. So we added a feature called blank material. So if we press Alt-M, we can add a blank material. And this will make a random material that is based off of just random grayscale values to create an either metallic or plastic type material just on the fly. So you can actually select a handful of objects, give them blank materials, just bam, blank material. And then get in here and adjust the preferences. The rules for this have actually been based on a lesson from Tony Leonard long ago. When I first started working with him, he always told me to stop using so many damn colors and to start working in shades of gray. So as a result, I've been working in shades of gray. And now this tool is basically shades of gray, the material generator. So, I mean, an idea from long ago that changed my way of approaching art. Here it is now in the form of a material generator. But, sometimes an idea takes a long time to manifest into something. So we have our cube, we have our blank material. Let's look at it in Look Dev. You look at it in Look Dev and you see that we don't have volumetrics. And that's because under here, we can turn on scene lights, which will use the lights from the actual scene itself. And then you can also use scene world, which will basically turn Look Dev into another render scene. And you don't want to do that. Look Dev's Look Dev. Let's let Look Devs be Look Devs, guys. So we'll just put a material here, and we're just rotating our thing around. This is pretty much like what you would get in Marmoset. I mean, I kind of glossed over this stuff, so I feel bad when I come back to it because there's cool stuff inside of Viewport, inside of Look Dev that's worth playing with. So this little drop it down sometime. You can get in here and look at an ambient occlusion pass or mist, or I mean, you can look at your normal, but who wants to look at that? And look at, if you could look at the normal and it showed a normal that looked like a normal matcap, you could basically model stuff and then look at this view, take a screenshot of it, put it in Quixel or Substance Painter, and just use it as a decal, like on the fly. That was something we used to do back in the day. Was we would put the material matcap on things, which here it is right here. So like that right there, that'll be a good normal map. I mean, not even joking. You put that on a normal map, you'll probably make it. Might have to do a little bit of normalization, a little normal humor there, but you get the idea. So continuing on. So we're in the render scene and we're looking at we don't want to look at the normal pass. All right. And so here's our cube. Here's our volumetrics. So that is volumetrics in a nutshell. And also talking about just materials and blank materials. So the last thing I want to talk about is the lighting flares. the flare of Eevee. So I'm just going to jump to render view, which all my views are just messed up because I keep putting weird stuff on. Like, here we go. Now I'm ready to work, except my plane looks crazy. All right, so that's the right plane. It looks like it's Z fighting, right? Like when I rotate the view, it just looks like it's fighting. There's like lines here. We're just going to roll with the punches. So all I want to do here is have some fun. Sheryl Crow reference, but what I want to do actually is press Alt W to switch over to box cutter, and we're just going to draw a cut right here and press X to turn that into a slice. And we're just going to take that little piece, give it a little tight bevel, and this little cube right here, let's make it smaller by raising the bowl shape, and let's lower this bevel too to make it accommodate. We're just going to select this object and give it a new material, and this material is going to be an emission. So this material, you can see just, it doesn't look like nothing in Viewport. If we wanted to, we can change the Viewport material through the Viewport display if you want your materials to be a certain thing. And I bring this up because I specifically make my emission materials green or red or something dumb, like definitely something where I know that, hey, those are my lights right there. So right here we have an emission. We're going to jump back into render, and now we have this glowing part of our cube, but it's glowing. We could raise the emission. Let's jump it up to 8. Let's jump it up to 80. That's hot, white hot, but it's not hot enough. Well, it's actually kind of hot. You can see this thing reflecting right here. Jeez. Wow, Blender, you are getting better every time I get inside of you. That sounds so weird, but continuing on. So bloom, that's why we have a light here. You turn on bloom, done. J.J. Abrams is going to give you a call. However, we do want to adjust some settings here. This bloom's like crazy. So we want to lower the radius. And then we can also adjust the threshold. So the threshold determines what gets grabbed. So by raising it, it only grabs the hottest hot and makes that the light. And by lowering it, it'll just grab more and more values closer to white and turn those into glares as well. So we turn it all the way down. The whole scene's just glare. But this thing is set to 80. So that's why we can really grab it on most levels of the threshold here. You can also lower the intensity, which I recommend because the emission can go real hot. Sometimes you want the emission to look like that, which can look good, but it really looks terrible. You can lower it down. Let's see, we'll bring it back down on the intensity, something like that, where it's just nice and hot. And then we'll lower the radius and just keep playing with it. So usually once I get the intensity lower, I will crank the radius back up. Like I just get weird when it comes to emissions. So the next thing I want to talk about is drivers. So for this, I actually have to pop open a document, but I got a bunch of box cutter complaints open here in a document that I'm dealing with. But at this point, I don't care. I got full confidence when I show you all the things I have complaints about because I guarantee you they're going to get solved. That's why I'm writing them down, because I want to bring them up in a organized fashion, write them on a large whiteboard, bring them up every day until they're resolved, and then from there tell you guys about how we solved them. So this particular driver right here, pound cause, open parentheses, frame times pi divided by 30 is just a very popular driver I like. The way I found it is it was used on a support the way I found it is it was in a support ticket where they were saying in Blender it didn't work, but in 2.8 I tried it and it worked. And I was like, oh my god, the support issue works. And not only that, this guy provided a driver that creates a repeatedly attenuating value. So if we put this in and press enter, now if we play the timeline, we have a light that just will pulse off and on. And I love this. I just love pulsing lights. I can't get over it. We're going to make a pulsing feature for blank material, spoiler alert, if Proxy gets it done, that will basically help make these a lot easier, because I'm tired of telling people about this particular formula, and I think we can just make them for you. But the problem is with our formula here, the value it's giving us isn't even hot enough to trigger the bloom anymore. So I'm no mathematician, but I do know how to go in here and just put times 10 at the end to get whatever number is going through there and multiply it by 10. And we see that it's not getting anywhere near 80. So, you know what, maybe 10's not enough. I'm no math magician, guys. So we'll just put 30 in there. And that works. But we could probably lower the threshold because the threshold was real high. And, you know, that's a little better. But we could probably pulse even harder. You know, I'm just going to jump it to 50. Don't tell anybody. There we go. You know, call me Matty McPulse with my pulsing material. I mean, the shadow here is looking a little busted. In fact, once I pause it and stop rotating things around, it'll look fine. But in the time, at the moment of real playback in the viewport, it's going to look crazy. So we've set up this scene and we've talked about rendering and we've made a render scene and talked about HDRIs and all this shit stuff. We talked about all this stuff and things, you know, to quote the late Rick Grimes, who may be coming back, but his show definitely isn't. So we're going to enable the camera. And, you know, interesting hotkey is Control-Alt-Numpad 0, which will just put the camera where your view is. So if you don't know, 1 is front view, 3 is side view, 7 is top view, 0 is numpad. And you can actually even press Control-0 and make any object a camera. Don't do that because it's kind of silly. I think Blender should probably make that a button somewhere. But, you know, or at least make it work on only cameras because you can make a cube a camera, which is kind of funny. You know, so I used to make speakers to camera just to be a weirdo, but don't be silly, guys. We'll look at this from the front, get it right where we want. And because a camera is present in our outliner here, I can see it. I'll just press Control-Alt-Numpad 0, and that'll put a camera here. And so we have our interrogation cube here. Like, y'all just don't have any idea what this cube has done. It's just terrible. Like, there's a massacre of a million other cubes in another window, all caused by this one guy. But continuing on, so we have our camera here. I want to select the camera and introduce you to the Hard Ops Q menu for cameras because everything in Blender has a Q menu. You know, like we wanted to solve the answer of what happens when you press Q for everything. In fact, Q is question. We'll give you some answers. If we don't give you answers, you should write us about what you feel the answer should be, and we'll talk to you about how we can make that happen or if it should happen, and you know, begin a dialogue on it. But continuing on. Inside of here are some camera options. Like I said, all of these settings are accessible in your camera panel, but I don't normally have this panel around. Usually I'm in full screen mode because full screen, no holds barred, let's get her done, guys, is my attitude. So we're just going to continue on here. So inside of here are camera options. In fact, as I navigate through this, I can see that it's not my favorite thing to navigate the camera. I'm just looking for the, in fact, if you press Q, the PP, that's what I want. When you turn it up, it actually darkens everything outside the border of your camera, allowing you to focus when you're in camera mode. So this is something I'm big about personally. I always blacken the border of my cameras when I'm doing camera cuts. So that way I'm not having to process all this stuff that's outside of it because, I mean, you should, if you're that type of guy, but sometimes I like to focus. You know, it's really on you as a preference. The next one that's in here is your millimeter. So by pulling it down, you can get like something more suspenseful, but we're going to have to move the camera to get back in there. So I'm just going to undo that. When it comes to the camera, because we have it selected, there are some general controls available to you. You can always just press G and move your camera around if you're just trying to really get that view just right. But if you're trying to really drive this thing like a forklift, you can press G, Z, Z, and slide it in and out to just drive this thing forward and backwards, you know. But if you really want to drive this thing like a car, let me tell you about Shift tilde. You press Shift tilde, you're like in this first person view mode. You like walk around with WASD and just look at this cube. Like, you know, actually there's a ground here. What's weird about this WASD mode, let me turn on everything so we can see it, and I'll show you it more in depth. But when you're in WASD, we press Shift tilde. You can see that there's hotkeys at the bottom of the screen. So Blender has a teleport option. You press spacebar, you freaking teleport there. You know, Blender ain't got VR support yet, but someone knows what's up. I love these guys. You know, I'm such a fanboy. I'm terrible. I'm going to die from loving Blender too much. But other hotkeys we have here is, I guess you could press tab to toggle gravity. It used to be G for gravity, but you can toggle gravity, right? So we can walk around this world now. but we're walking too slow. So you can actually scroll the wheel and walk faster. So I'm just walking with WASD and moving my mouse around. Like if you were in a first person shooter game, this is how you would walk around your scene. And I'm the camera. So I could just really just look at this thing. Just, hey Cube, what did you do, you bastard? You know, what did you do to those spheres? You know, just really just strafe on this guy. Like if I was a gun in a game, like this guy would have died like 800 times. You know, I don't mess around. Like this guy would have, I shot this guy right in his green cube. So he better not move. But just letting you know that you can use Shift tilde as a way to like deal with your camera. And the interesting thing is that even if you're not in camera, you can just navigate your scene with Shift tilde. You can press G and just drop yourself on the ground. You know, sometimes when I'm feeling suicidal, as crazy as it sounds, I will just drop myself from really high and just watch myself fall through my scenes. You know, just being random. You know, Blender is all about being random. Like I love the people behind all these decisions because I find them and I'm like, that's so random. And then, you know, I think we try to expand on that same thought process too by being somewhat random because, I mean, Blender's definitely trying to be the best at what it is, but Blender's also pretty good at being pretty random. Like they got a whole bunch of random goodies in addition to their actual goodies for getting work done. So back to talking about rendering, we have our camera here. We have our render here. Let's turn off all the viewport elements so we can only see our render. This is what we have right now. So if we render with, you know, render image, this is our render, which is actually not the render that we set up in our viewport. So, you know, what's up with that? You know what it is if we look at our outliner, we have this light that's disabled. This light is this light, this little light of mine. And I'm going to let it shine as that light right there. And that light just has to go. It's just giving too much light to the scene. So we're just going to render image again and let this go. Also, sorry for y'all who are sitting through an hour-long lecture. I see that this talk ended up going longer than I thought. I thought I was only going to be talking like 15 minutes. And then Clackety Key J had to break my focus and concentration. So I've been having to work my way back into the zone. So continuing on, so this is our render. Our render now looks like our viewport, and that's because everything here is what's in there. So if you have something here that's disabled, like if I disable this light, this is what my viewport looks like. But when I press F12, that is what my render is going to look like. So you just need to be aware that whatever's on your layer is going to be there. So I'm going to wrap this up by definitely talking about the most crucial parts that I feel you should know about Blender and how to render, at least from me. Like I said, I'm no authority, but if you're coming to me for answers, I'll give them to you. We're going to take this cube and we're going to move it to a collection called Cube. So when it comes to scene management, you don't want to be, you could either try to be a gladiator and build everything in the same scene, or you can have a scene that is, you know, like we're going to make this first scene our collection. So this is SCN, just something I've been doing since Unity. So we press 1, we're on the SCN. We'll actually drag the cutters down and make it collection number 3, but we can't do that if it's expanded. It's kind of weird. So we'll just drag it up, and now we can press 1, 2 is our cube, 3 is our cutters. We don't care about the cutters, just cutters, but it has to be there for utility purposes. So we go back to scene. This is what we have. We go to 2, here's our cube, but we want to use our cube in this scene, but we don't want to render both our cube and the scene. Like let's say we were modifying this cube especially, and we were setting up this scene to be a special scene. So let's insert a collection instance of that cube. So here's our cube on the floor. This cube is literally a duplicate of the other scene. So that's why I can move this over. And here's layer 1, right? Layer 1 is just this cube at an angle. Layer 2 is the original cube. I can go in here, mod scroll, bring back the original cutter, modify it, go back here. This thing's been updated. We can look at it in top view, and I'm just going to duplicate it around. You know, this cube, his comrades came to bust him out. You know, he heard we were interrogating his main, so these cubes have come to really bust him out the clink. So we'll just multiply these because they're all proxies of the original cube. It doesn't matter. This is the scene that matters. We can go here and modify this single cutter again, just like so. and go here, and here's our render. And if we jump into render, this is what our scene looks like, but this isn't what our scene actually is, because in this scene, our light is turned off. So if we turn our light on, this is what we actually have, which looks kind of dumb. So if we press 0, we can look at this through the camera view, which looks even dumber. So we'll put one of these back in the center and face it at us, the viewer. Just kind of move some of these off on the side. We're not really trying to set up like an award-winning render here. Just talk about setting up your scene and dealing with your object that you're cutting versus your render that you're showcasing, because you could easily work in the same collection and then showcase your scene, but really there should be a disconnect between what your scene is and what your model is that you're working on here. I wish that we could change collections and also just change this to technical view, but that's a scope creep. You see this shading issue right here? We can actually fix that by just going to modifier and shift clicking on weighted normal, because I just can't live with that. I'm sorry. Me and AR argue a lot internally about weighted normal and whether it should be used. Until this shading issue is not a thing, I'm going to have to use weighted normal because I can't just look at that. So this is your scene where you're working on the object. In fact, we can bring back the cutter again. I keep doing this to make it a point, because I've been talking to people about it. I can go in edit mode, duplicate this thing, really just put some pulsars on it by just duplicating in edit mode. We go to this one. This has been updated. This is our scene that we actually want to render. And so I'm sorry for this long rant, but it's almost to the conclusion, I promise. So here we'll go to back to our viewport, and I just want to render an animation, but I don't want to render animation of the camera sitting here for like 5 minutes, because that's boring as hell. So what's common in the 3D industry is rendering a damn turntable, because that's how you get the work. You put out your turntables and your wireframes. So I'm also wanting to emphasize more on teaching people the skills for them to be an industry standard, because I've been a little bit of a weirdo myself. So we're just going to insert a sphere, and we're going to right click and just fix the draw size, make it bigger. And we'll select the camera, select this empty, press Control P, and just object keep transform. And basically this object is now parented to the empty. And when I rotate the empty, the camera's rotating. So if I rotate the scene, this is what's going on. So it's like that Savage Garden music video. I'm not going to sing that in this video because it'll get me demonetized, but the song. Every 16-year-old girl loved it. So we want this to rotate perpetually. Like I said, I'm a big fan of drivers. I could be teaching you how to press I and set a keyframe for rotation. And then I would tell you about how when you add a keyframe, it puts a keyframe for rotation in all 3 of these, which I was about to complain about it, but I realized that actually makes sense, right? You add a keyframe for rotation. You want every aspect of rotation keyed, but I just don't like setting keyframes anymore unless they mean something. Like for something like this, where it's a rotating camera, I don't need keyframes, because then I'll have a action strip, which is another piece of data in the file, and I just don't want to deal with that, all right? So if we move the Z, this is the one we want to move. And so, driver talk, hashtag frame. And all that does is it takes the frame in the scene and puts it in the evaluation for rotation. So this is not like black magic. It's literally saying, what frame is it? Make the rotation that, or something. I mean, the rotation is just out of control here. So there might be some difference between the frame and the degree delineation. But anyways, this is what we want as our render, right? That's what you want. Now, if you're saying that's too fast, you've never seen a Master Xeon tutorial before. So we're going to click on this, and we're going to change it to frame divided by, or actually, we're going to change it to frame multiplied by 0.02. And now we are multiplying it, but I'm no good at math, guys. I'm terrible, but I just know it works, all right? There's people who work with us who explain math to me, and then I try to explain it to y'all. But now we have the scene actually rotating around on a turntable. So I'm actually pretty picky about my first frame and my end frame being the exact same frame, because if we play this out as a animation, it's not going to be seamless. It's going to be jerky. It's going to be all the way to the end, and then it's going to be this frame, and it's going to be this frame again. So I like to just jump through here. Actually, what I'll do is use my 3D cursor, and we'll just poke it on Hook it on the nose. And let's see, we want to catch this when it comes back around, which we don't even catch it back around, so we need to give it more frames. So we'll raise this to 500 frames just for this. And right here, we'll just make that the end frame. So this is frame 319, 319. And I'm working on a way to make it where we can actually use, I want to work on a driver that makes it where it takes the amount of frames you have in the scene and makes it a perfect 360. It would be like the ultimate driver. So I'm saying now I wish I had it, but I guarantee you there's some smarty pants out there who's like, dude, it's this. And you're probably sitting in this room right now. So if I go to the beginning, this is what it is. If I go to the end, it's this. So we'll just let it play out. We'll just see how it transitions. It's not going to transition nice. And also, ignore the shadows. Blender's a work in progress. This program's going through a lot of growing pains, so a little bit of shadow weirdness. You saw that skip, so we were close. This is where we are. This is where we're sending it. And that's probably where we actually want it. Let's see, 316. Let's see, maybe 317. Nope, we have to go lower, so I'm going to go down to 314. I mean, this is a little bit of a balancing act, I know. But this be life. $310, so I'm needing to take away even more of it. This is where it is, so I need to give it just a little bit more room. I could just be very specific with this, but for some reason, I should have actually thought this out because, here, let's actually think this out real quick because this is freaking dumb. I'm not going to waste my time doing this crap. You know what? We're going to look at this from the front view. So front view, double tap 8 to look at it from an angle. We're going to press Control Alt Numpad 0. I'm sorry. Sometimes I realize that I'm pressing too many keystrokes to solve a problem, and then I just need to step away and reevaluate what I'm doing and solve it properly. So we're on frame 1, and because there's already a driver here, this has already been rotated 1.15 degrees, which is fine because we're not going to modify the driver anymore, but we are going to select the camera and Control P, parent it once again. And so we're right here head on. We'll just put our 3D cursor here. And let's jump to the end. And right there. So 315. And so if we look at this from the start frame and the end frame, we're almost there. So we just take away one frame. And now if this thing is looping, it'll loop just right. So, I mean, I just wanted to make sure I showed y'all how to create a looping GIF that's just right. I mean, we could have worked the math a little bit where we don't need 315 frames for this, make it render like 250, but you can see now it's actually a smooth transition. So if I were to render this, I would use a program called DJV or even the Blender render playback thing to play back my image sequence where I would just watch this thing play over and over and just admire, what I created here, which in this case isn't anything fantastic. I mean, the lighting is just absolutely atrocious. I just wanted to talk about using volumetric, setting up light, setting up a render, and setting up a turntable because this is the protocol of how you would typically go about setting up a scene, which puts me at 58 minutes. And with that, I'll hit stop, and this is over.